The night in jail was long. The detainees had no water. The air conditioning turned down to 50 degrees. There were no blankets, no place to lie down except the cement floor. The lights were kept on all the time. Guards banged the steel doors to keep everyone awake. Several Unitarian Universalist social activists were held in jail overnight for protesting the inhumane treatment of undocumented people in Arizona between 2010 and 12, under the watch of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. The sheriff, now known for tactics of humiliation, inhumane treatment of undocumented inmates, as well as found guilty of racial profiling in policing. Some of the protesters were in a cell close to a group of undocumented women who were likely scheduled to be deported to Mexico. In their Standing on the Side of Love bright yellow t-shirts, they found ways to communicate their support to the detainees. They motioned, "I see you. I love you. Si se puede. Yes, we can," the motto of Cesar Chavez. These activists were clear in their role, that theirs was a public witness and solidarity, that their night in jail, uncomfortable as it was not about them. It never was. Their discomfort paled in comparison to the experience of the undocumented individuals whose very lives, families, homes, dreams were at stake. As Unitarian Universalists, we are inheritors, bearers of a tradition that has always believed in the centrality of justice, that the allegiance of the heart, the allegiance of our tradition, is a commitment of the heart and the mind and the soul beyond any nationality or legality to justice and fairness and compassion. Even the street our church is on, Walden Lane, which was named by this congregation when the church was built in the 60s, it gives imagery of this tranquil pond near Concord, Massachusetts, living a life close to nature, void of noise and of stress in the teachings of Henry David Thoreau. Even the seemingly peaceful sentiment of Walden has a history of civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau, in his essay titled Civil Disobedience, writes this: "If injustice is part of the necessary friction of the government, then let it go. If it is of such a nature that it requires you to be an agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop that machine. I must not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn, and unjust laws exist. So shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? As for adopting the ways which the state has provided for remedying the evil of unjust laws, well, that takes too much time. One's life will be gone." He says, "When I converse with the freest of my neighbors, I perceive that whatever they say about the magnitude and the seriousness of the issue of the day and their regard for the public tranquility, the long and the short of the matter is this: they dread the consequences to their property and to their families of disobedience to the government." That was written in the mid-1800s. As this congregation is in the midst of voting on a congregational resolution, a resolution that would enable the board to discern to become either a sanctuary or sanctuary-supporting church, there have been many important conversations happening, good questions, valid concerns, deep reflection. For those who have not been able to attend the forums or are very new to the congregation or haven't been to the services or read some of the information provided or online questions and answers, here's just a very brief summary. If the congregation votes positively for the resolution, and if the board decides and discerns that we could become a sanctuary church, we would be then open to request through Isaiah, Minnesota, an interfaith justice organization, to host one individual or one family in our church who are facing the threat of deportation. It would not be indefinite. It would be a delaying process as they work with social and legal resources to find ways to stay in the country legally. If the board decides to become a sanctuary supporting congregation, then we would support another church or institution that is doing that work through volunteers or other types of aid. Churches, along with hospitals and schools, are considered historically and by current policy as sensitive locations. where immigration law enforcement is far less likely to enter and remove a person to be deported. It's not impossible, but unlikely. The fact that we are a church as compared to an individual residence provides a different legal framework and different sense of safety and refuge. We would only do this in response to requests through Isaiah, and most importantly, only upon request from an individual or a family who wants to do this, knowing the risks involved to them, which is far more than to the congregation. Isaiah, the interfaith organization, is engaged in processes to help determine good candidates for sanctuary, meaning that they have potential to stay legally and are likely already connected to resources, social and legal, that would help them stay. And mostly this would be a practice of public witness. We would tell their story publicly if someone came to our church so that it would lift up the conversation in the wider community. We wouldn't be harboring or hiding or concealing anybody, and there are various opinions among legal experts if housing someone in the church is clearly breaking the law or not, and if so, which laws exactly. So we've connected with legal counsel so we're aware of the many different things to consider. But with any justice work, there are things that are uncertain and things that you just can't plan for, which is also life. This is one way, not the only way, not the premier way, not the best necessarily. There are many ways to engage in immigration justice work, but this is one way, and it's a particular way that churches are positioned to engage in this work. So that's just a snapshot. And within that, people of goodwill in this congregation and beyond, from phone calls I've received from people in the community, have very different opinions about this, about its efficacy, its intent, its consequences. It would be disingenuous as your newly called minister coming in the midst of this process in the congregation to be unclear about my beliefs around the sanctuary church movement. While the board is rightly so unable to make a public stance on the resolution during this voting process, as your minister, and by the nature of a free pulpit, I'm charged and actually called, it's my job, to speak the truth as I understand it in love. So you know what? I do not want to go to jail. I don't think anybody wishes for that. I don't think my daughters or my wife wish for that in particular. But you know what else? It's not about me. It's not even about this church. This work and these conversations, regardless of where you're sitting with them, is about marginalized communities that are crying out for help. It's about privileged individuals and institutions that have resources to leverage. And it's about a belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person that transcends borders. Regardless of the outcome of the vote, it is clear that this church and our tradition have and will continue to work for a more just and beautiful world in a variety of ways, in 1,000 ways, to provide sanctuary in the largest sense, the largest, broadest definition. Sanctuary for the body and the mind and the soul, sanctuary for marginalized communities and individuals, to be bold in our support for those who are under the weight of systemic oppression because of their skin color, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their ethnic heritage, their nationality, their religious belief. There is no shortage of marginalization and oppression in our culture right now, and there hasn't been a shortage of that for a long time. This whole conversation around this old, ancient religious teaching that shows up on red signs throughout the city of love thy neighbor as thyself is about noticing the stranger, noticing whomever at a particular moment or a particular time is lying in the gutter and other people are just passing by in need of compassion. It's about searching deep within and asking ourselves, what can we offer? What have we to offer to the bending of the moral arc of the universe toward justice? That phrase, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, perhaps you're familiar with it, is from Unitarian Theodore Parker in the mid-1800s. It was made famous by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King, in his speech entitled The Knock at Midnight, has a powerful reminder of what the church is called to in society. He writes, in many instances, the church has so aligned itself with the privileged classes and so defended the status quo that it has been unwilling to answer the knock of the lonely traveler at midnight. The church must be reminded that it is not the master nor the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. And if the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. If the church does not participate actively in the struggle for peace and for economic and racial justice, it will forfeit the loyalty of millions and cause people everywhere to say that it has atrophied its will. But if the church will free itself from the shackles of a deadening status quo and recovering its great historic mission, will speak and act fearlessly and insistently in terms of justice and peace, then people far and near will know the church as a great fellowship of love that provides light and bread for lonely travelers at midnight. It just makes me wonder, where was it when we first fell into the delusion of our separateness, of our otherness? Was it somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates, or at the Rio Grande, or near the Mississippi, somewhere down from the Tower of Babel, as we fell into the first sin of fearing difference, and we began to build walls? In the dry air and the hot sun, there are families longing for life and freedom, for food on the table, for safety for their children, and they cross the desert as their only hope. The ancient texts remind us, and the justice workers and the poets remind us, that God has a history of traveling hand in hand with the oppressed through the desert, toward liberation and life and survival and hope. The desert is also a condition of the heart, the hardened heart, that many traditions speak of indifference, of intolerance, of apathy. And the walls that we place around us to seemingly protect ourselves, we soon realize are a different kind of prison wall, locking us in golden cages of privilege, isolating us from the fabric of life, from our kindred, which is all people. Humanity has a good track record of building walls of prejudice and fear and a delusional false sense of right ownership, as if we aren't all guests on any land that we inhabit. Heaven has no borders in the universalist tradition. When we forget this, we set up the gates of hell. Kaukalia Yang, a Hmong American and author of the book The Late Homecomer, writes about what home means, how identity is more fluid than the borders that humanity has placed around it. What is home to the immigrant, to the refugee? What is home to the poor and the outcast and the neglected? Now, while the Hmong experience in Minnesota is not the same as the experience of Mexican and Latinx people, there are so many similarities around identity, around land, around belonging. Kaukalia Yang writes,
Hmong is an ethnic minority. We don't have a country. We are here looking for a home.
My family walked away from a land that they loved, the land holding their brother, the land holding the grave of their father.
My father was hit to the ground by a soldier in the refugee camp. He said later, "It was the first time I felt like I would never find a place like the village where I was born. I kept thinking, I am a man too. I have a wife and a child, but it didn't matter because we had no home anymore."
The Hmong had been like the land, fertile and green, waiting for new growth. Because we were an old people, our lands had grown wild. And in this refugee camp, our big trees would be cut down, our large stones thrown out, and new seeds would be planted. The Hmong people were pushed together, and then pushed apart, and then pushed out.
I knew that long ago my family had lived on such mountains. I knew that my grandfather had been buried on such mountains. I knew that my grandmother had been born on such mountains. The mountains were our forever, long ago homes. I wondered if one day I would walk upon them.
English was hard on my tongue. I was learning the meanings of words and how to write them, but my voice, my own voice, sounded different to me in English.
A new chapter of our lives unfolded as we strive to become Americans. We sank our roots deep into the land, took stake in the ground, and prayed to the moon that one day the wind would carry us into a stronger home that could not be taken away, that would not fall down on us, that would hold us safe and warm.
There was a clear division for me, the Hmong heart, the part that held the hands of my mom and dad and grandma protectively every time we encountered the outside world, the part that cried because Hmong people didn't have a home, the part that listened to Hmong songs and fluttered about looking for clean air and crisp mountains in flat St. Paul, or the American heart, the part that was lonely for the outside world, that stood by and watched the fluency of other parents with their boys and girls, children who lingered in the clubs and the sports teams after school, waiting to be picked up later by parents who could pick them up.
My father said it is very important that you tell this part of our story. The Hmong came to America without a homeland. Even in the very beginning, we knew we were looking for a home. Other people in moments of sadness and despair can look to a place in the world where they might belong. We are not like that. I knew that our chance was here, our chance to share in a new place and a new home.
For Kaukalia Yang, for Yesu and Maria, Rosalita and Juan, for parents and children and sisters and brothers, for workers and builders and dreamers, for so many lonely travelers at midnight because of the circumstances of where they came from, or because of the life they built out of hope and need, because this land, this place which has treated them as other and stranger, is the only place they have ever known that might be, could be, home. For so many, the choice is so clear. It is far better to risk life and liberty, risk breaking the law, because it is suffocating the chances out of any life worth living at all. When a hard heart is watered with empathy, and an uncertain soul is soaked in compassion, rigid borders begin to dissolve. Something happens, at least for me, when I begin to feel even a tiny bit the hot desert sun on the back, or feel the weeping of parents for their children in uncertainty, and feel the heartache of longing for a different life. Something happens when we remember the other is actually in our midst, earning paychecks and buying diapers, studying physics and writing poetry, living the dreams of their ancestors against a waiting line longer than their chance of survival. Something happens when the people remember they are family, and we have the tools we need, like Joshua at Jericho, to dance down the wall. Maybe from our Universalist tradition, heaven looks like this. And so the wall came down, and the children embraced their parents, and people found dignified work, and the hardened heart melted into love, because the people remembered who they were, and that heaven and justice was theirs to create, and the walls came tumbling down, crumbling to dust from the dancing rhythm of the songs, the poems, and the common work of love made flesh, enough love to hold us all. Danny Brick, a part of a coalition of Jewish people of color, wrote these words, entitled, "If You Could Go Back." He says, I know if you could go back, you'd walk with Jesus. You'd march with King, maybe assassinate Hitler, at least hide a few Jews in your basement. It'd all be very clear to you. But people then, just like you, were baffled, and they had bills to pay, they had children they didn't understand, and they were so desperate for normalcy, they made anything seem normal and hid in their houses. They watched it on television, and they wrung their hands, or they didn't, because they were afraid and their parents were sick and their job paid horribly. And what's with those kids sitting down in the highway, they thought, chaining themselves to buildings? What's their problem? Well, that kid, that's King. And this is Selma, and Berlin, and Jerusalem. And now is when they need you to be brave. Now is when we need to go back and give up the things we're chained to and make it look so easy in our grandkids' history books. Now, right now, is when someday it's going to be all clear to them. The question, always and still is, how is it ethical? In a country created on stolen land, built on the backs of enslaved people? How is it ethical in any moral code to build walls and enforce borders so rigidly, so inhumanely, that people and their stories and their lives and their dreams are expendable, insignificant, too costly, too complicated, that we become, in the words of Dr. King speaking about the white moderate, more committed to order than to justice? The question from ancient scripture, no matter how you have voted on the resolution or how you might, is a moral question. It's not political. It is. And it's ethical. It's spiritual. And for religious people, this is a deep down question beyond partisan politics. The question from the stranger, the immigrant, the refugee is, behold, I stand at the door at midnight and I knock. Are you ready? In what ways are we ready to lift up the gates and say to the lonely traveler at midnight, come, share our bread. Here you are welcome. The close